think you all know the location of Santa Clara. That's where we're at now. But right down here is kind of the village of Espanola. This is the Santa Clara Creek watershed. It flows perennially for about 22 miles from the tops of the Jemez Mountains. We've got a few peaks up here that are over 10,000 feet. So quite a bit of vertical relief between the tops of the Jemez and the bottom of the Espanola Valley, about 5,000 feet of elevation between the two. When the Los Conchas fire hit, it's been over 10 years now, but it basically devastated this whole upper part of the watershed, and the erosion was extremely severe coming out of this, and which produced very significant flash floods coming through here, which further degraded the watershed. And so what I was going to talk today about basically was a few different things. The first topic I was going to get into was what I like to refer to as selective stabilization in burned areas. I'll also talk a little bit about what we've done here at Santa Clara, and then we'll kind of get into more specifics about what we've done restoring upland slopes, restoring ephemeral channels, restoring alluvial fans, and restoring the perennial streams as well, and also some of the monitoring stuff that we've been doing to keep track of our progress. And the mountains will erode into the ocean. Erosion is a natural process. It's not something that we can stop. It's certainly really good for the environment, bringing more fertile soils from the mountains down into the valleys. But we can work with that process, and we can make it much better and try to mitigate the effects of severe erosion following a catastrophic wildfire. And so not even Arnold Schwarzenegger can stop a flash flood. He can try, but in the end, you better call for the chopper. Better call for the chopper now, right now, right? However, but we can slow down this process and the effect of the speed in the microsites where the erosion occurs. And that's kind of what we've really concentrated on here at Santa Clara. And so I want to get into this, what we typically refer to as selective stabilization. A lot of times, after a big fire, you'll get the Bear team that'll come in and they'll really promote stabilization. But it's important to realize that you really need to be selective with what you stabilize and what you don't stabilize, because it certainly has an effect on each other. A lot of times folks will concentrate on maybe restoring the bed itself to actually try to agrade these incised channels, and that's typically what we do. We don't do much bank stabilization in channels and stuff that are already incised and degrading, because what we found is when you stabilize the banks, you basically put more pressure on the stream bed. And likewise, if you stabilize the stream bed, you put more pressure on the banks. So it's kind of important to realize that and really figure out what you want to stabilize and what you don't. So I kind of look at this as, after a big fire like this, if you're working in an incised channel, you kind of have four options. And the first one up there, you could choose to do nothing. And the trend of that over time is, this would be maybe a couple decades, but if you do nothing, that incision is going to get deeper and deeper and deeper over time, which is a bad trend, of course, because historically the water was up here, it would overbank, it would support riparian vegetation, but as that channel drops further and further, that's getting more disconnected from where your water is going to be and where your riparian vegetation is going to be, and consequently you'll start to lose that, which will increase the erosion further and further. A second choice that you could possibly do is try to stabilize everything. You could actually stabilize the banks and the bed of a degraded channel. However, the problem with that is you kind of set up this system where it's not really going to change and evolve much, and it's already incised, so it's almost like a permanent gutter system. And also, if you do choose to stabilize everything, you're going to put a lot more pressure on the downstream side of that. The water always wants to erode something, so if you're protecting an area, you're going to increase erosion on another area. The third option would be to stabilize only the banks, which is typically a big mistake following a catastrophic fire if you're working in an incised channel, because by stabilizing the bank, you're going to increase the erosion on the bed, and that's going to cut deeper and deeper and deeper, and eventually your bank stabilization structures are probably going to fail, and you've actually created this deeper than it would have been if it was just left alone. So we've found that it's typically a bad idea to try any type of bank stabilization if you're working in an incised channel following a fire. And the fourth option is typically what we do. We choose to stabilize and grade only the bed of the channel. In this example here, we put like a rock dam in. There's basically two functions behind that rock dam. Number one, it's going to protect the stream bed from eroding further. And number two, it should help grade that channel just slightly because sediment's going to back up against that rock dam. And over time, as that fills in, we can come in and we can do another rock dam and grade it a little bit further and a little bit further. And then over time, hopefully, as the end result, we get back to a more natural channel where we can actually have water over banking and supporting the riparian vegetation. And that's kind of always been our goal. Okay, so at Santa Clara, we've had a lot of experience with watershed restoration. We've had 3 catastrophic fires over the past 25 years or so, which started with the Oso Complex fire, which I think was in 1998. But after that, we started meeting with a person called Bill Zedike, who's a renowned stream expert here in northern New Mexico. We're really blessed and lucky to have Bill. And he really came in and helped get this process jump-started. Just a phenomenal resource if you're ever restoring watersheds. Bill's getting up there in age now. He's in his upper 80s. He retired officially a couple years back, but he can't keep away. He'll still come out and look at things and help out. So just an absolutely wonderful resource that we've been able to tap here at Santa Clara that's really helped get this process underway. Following the Oso fire, we had the Cerro Grande fire, which was a much bigger fire. The Oso fire, I want to say, was maybe 3,000, 4,000 acres that hit Santa Clara. The Cerro Grande was about 7,000. Then we got to the Los Conchas, and we're over 20,000. But luckily for Santa Clara, they kind of built this experience along the way. So when we did get hit by the Los Conchas fire, we did have trained staff, and we had a lot of motivated people that could really get out and help. The Santa Clara Pueblo Department of Forestry was just completely instrumental in that, with really hard-working field crews that would go out and help get this stuff underway. And since we've started doing all the restoration work on the Los Conchas fire, we've now built, we're approaching 8,000 structures that we've built in all the different tributaries and the stream itself. So we've been very busy, and altogether, let's see, we've done over 15,000 acres of sub-watersheds and about 39 miles of tributaries and stream corridors. And there's 4 basic types of stabilization that I was going to touch on real quick. One was upland slope stabilization. What we typically do with our upland slopes is we try to do a lot of contour tree felling. Sometimes we'll actually do some grass seeding and some vegetation work as well. Anything we can to kind of stabilize those upland slopes, because the upland slopes largely will affect the tributaries themselves. If they're not restored, then we can expect much more increased pressure in the tributaries with more water coming through. Then secondly, we're going to talk about ephemeral channel restoration, which has probably been, 90% of all the restoration work that I've been involved with. It's actually been in the tributaries, working in ephemeral channels where we actually don't have much water flow. But then we've also done a little bit of work in the perennial stream as well. And something we've been getting more and more into, which Alan touched on, was the alluvial fan restoration. We have lots of spots where tributaries come down into the canyon, and then once they get close to the creek and the grade changes, it kind of spills out into this big alluvial fan, which actually is really important ecologically because they're kind of like a sponge. When you get flows coming down these ephemeral channels, when they get onto that alluvial fan, you see a different influx of different vegetation. It's not quite riparian, but it's not quite upland either. So some really important ecological niches that you find within these alluvial fans. And following the Lost Conscious fire, it was so severe, a lot of these alluvial fans would start to get incised. And so we've done a fair amount of work to try to spread water evenly across those alluvial fans as it used to be before the fire. And upland slope stabilization. I'm going to just move to the next slide to kind of get a picture of this. But contour tree felling, we've done a tremendous amount of contour tree felling in our upland slopes. And it's really important when we do this that the logs lay flush on the ground and that they're kind of pinned in, if we can, to different spots so they won't move around. But what's most important is a lot of times you'll fell a tree, for contour felling, and you may have a little rift or a little channel underneath it that'll, incise if you don't fix it. So it's incredibly important that these lay flat on the ground. And if you do have little small openings underneath the logs, you really want to take the time to stuff that full of branches and rock or whatever you can find to not aggravate the situation rather than restore those slopes. All right, so again, the most common treatment that we've done is ephemeral channel restoration. We've worked over 30 miles of different channels leading up into the creek. And by working those channels, we've really slowed down the sediment supply in Santa Clara Creek. The Santa Clara Pueblo Office of Environmental Affairs constantly monitors the upper creek, and we've seen the sediment drop substantially over the past 10 years, probably largely associated with all the structures and stuff we've built that's helped keep the sediment out of the major creek. Let's see, in channel restoration and ephemeral stuff, we typically will go up to about 30%, sometimes up to 40, but we typically try to stay out of the real steep stuff. Sometimes in ephemeral channels that are real steep, that are eroding, we'll do some directional tree felling, stuff like that. But we typically won't get in and make busy structures if the channel is over 30, 40%. And move to the next slide. In these next few slides, I was going to just show kind of a mix of all the different types of structures that we've been using here at Santa Clara and how they're effective. But I was just mentioning directional tree felling. You can see that here in this gully. But just felling trees, to catch sediment, we typically try to fall the tops so they're facing the top of the stream, and then so sediment will come down here, hopefully catch along those branches, and this will ultimately, hopefully, help agrade this channel coming in here. Packing and stuffing, when we first started restoring these channels in the upland slopes, we were so overwhelmed. We had over 30 different tributaries that we knew needed treatment. And when we first got into the hills, we only had a few months until monsoon season. So rather than really picking one tributary to try to do a really good job, what we did is we really spread our work out, and we just tried to pack and stuff some of these upper tributaries for the time being, just with logs and rocks to help catch sediment. And then when we had more time later in our efforts, we would actually come back and make structures out of these. But that's something you may want to consider if you get hit by a really big catastrophic wildfire and you don't have much time until the monsoons are approaching. Rather than just pick a certain area, maybe just try to do bigger areas, but not do as an intensive work in each. Another structure that's extremely effective and very easy to make are one-rock dams. We've got a good picture of one right here. Typically, we'll just pack rock, across the channel, side to side. We usually try to make 5 rows of rock, but it really depends on how big the channel is that's coming in. But one thing I love about rock dams is once you do these and you actually, start catching some sediment, you typically get this huge influx of vegetation growing behind it, which actually further stabilizes the channel. And so it's a really good method to kind of promote vegetation in channels as well. And moving right along, we've got a few more structures here. This is what we usually call a log drop. With our log drops, they typically go perpendicular to the channel. We try to kind of tie them in, on each sides. And we found it's extremely beneficial if you're just doing simple log drops to try to pack rock on the upslope and the downslope of these, which will hopefully prevent the water from trying to get underneath. If you just lay a log across, a lot of times the water will try to undercut that log. So it's really important, I think, to pack things around that. We've had a lot more success since we started packing rock around our log drops. Zuni bowls is kind of a good way to deal with a head cut. And this before was maybe a 2-foot drop where the water would come down and it was eroding further and further. But by creating this little rock bowl here, it prevents that from degrading further, and then it actually will catch a little water and hold a little water after we get rain and stuff, which is a good little wildlife enhancement tool as well. Rock rundowns on this picture over here. This was all barren soil before we started, but we had loads of rock on the upper slopes, and so we just caved it all in and lined that all with rock. And by doing that, that shouldn't erode any further. This is probably, out of all the structures we've made, I would say the most of what we've done has been log mattresses. I love these structures. They're just super easy to make, and they're very effective. Here we lay logs parallel to the direction of flow, and we just kind of pack it into the channel, try to get it secured in there. Prevents the channel from incising or degrading further, and it also will catch a little sediment and help abrade the channel. In this picture here, we've got what we call a large log rundown. This was an enormous head cut that you can't really tell from this picture, but the Santa Clara Canyon Road was just above this, and this head cut was really close to taking out the road. So we put a tremendous amount of effort into this structure, actually lining it all with logs and dropping the water down and trying to kind of position our logs so we kind of get that V shape so the water won't escape. But hopefully that'll hold, and that will prevent this head cut from doing any further resource damage. Another technique we use that's extremely effective is just transplanting local vegetation. This was a barren slope coming down the channel that was eroding pretty quickly, but just by taking little clumps of grass from the sides of the channel and transplanting them in here, that's basically stabilized that, just using the vegetation. Okay, and another type of effective structure, and this really comes from Bill Zedike's work in his book called Let the Water Do the Work, but it's this whole concept of induced meandering. Before we went and did anything in this channel, which you can see on this picture on the left, water would just shoot down this tributary going, basically a straight line, and, degrading it and incising it further and further every time a flood event would come. But in this particular channel, we had a decent width from side to side. It wasn't too incised where we couldn't do anything down here in the bed. And so what we chose to do is we actually made some log pyramids, which actually made the water meander from one side to the other. And in doing that, we're slowing the water down tremendously as it comes down through here. And actually, with an induced meandering, it's wonderful too. Every time you induce a meander, it's coming over this way, but as the water comes down, all the sediment is going to deposit here, right after that curved structure. So most people don't think of, induced meandering as actually capturing sediment, but it actually is true. It captures tons of sediment. Anytime you induce a meander like that, the water is going to swirl around and deposit sediment on the back side of that structure. Same here, and the same on the bottom structure. And this is kind of one of our claims to fame, I would think, in Santa Clara Canyon. We had a lot of super incised channels where, gosh, some of these gullies that we worked in were 30 feet deep. And so, working with rock dams and everything works, but we wanted to make, a bigger structure where we could actually capture more sediment and not have to put so much maintenance work in. But what we came up with was these, which we call Santa Clara sediment traps. But we came up with this tactic where we'd actually poke holes in the sides of the channel, using pickaxes on both sides, and we would lay a cross beam across, and we would get that in there super tight, so we knew it wasn't going to move. And then we basically buck up burnt timber, logs, and we'd lay them up at a 45-degree angle up against that beam. And then we'd usually pack the bottom with rock so water wouldn't get underneath it. But as these flash floods came down, then we found out these were incredibly effective. They weren't packed close enough where it would prevent water from getting through. Water could get through the logs, but the sediment would get trapped behind. And in one particular drainage, which we call Colonel Canyon, we've actually done a huge series of these where we've really stepped it down at what we thought was almost the natural grade of that channel. And so far, after we've been in there, 4 different times maintaining this tributary, but we've abraded this tributary about 8 feet. So these can be very effective. One thing to consider, though, when you do make a big structure like this, if it fills up, of course, you're going to have a big water drop here. So it's important to kind of line the bottom with like a log mattress or something that'll prevent the bottom side from eroding. And also, if you kind of get them close together like that, at the historic grade of the channel, they'll kind of fill up at the same time, and each structure will protect the other structure in a sense. And so it's all filling up basically at the same rate. And here's a good picture of one that's about half full. And we have to constantly monitor these to make sure that they're not doing anything adverse. Once they fill completely up, the force of the water dropping is going to be a lot. So if you just put one of these out by itself, you really have to monitor it. Once you're getting close to being full, then you need to do something downstream from it so you're catching all the sediment that's coming off of that. Okay, alluvial fan restoration. Again, Alan had touched on this a little bit. It's kind of a good picture of an alluvial fan I found from the internet. You have a tributary coming down, and once it changes grade and maybe it's getting to its primary channel here, it's spilling out. And again, this is just kind of like a big sponge that absorbs more water than the surrounding areas. So really ecologically important to keep an eye on these alluvial fans. After the Los Conchas fire, a lot of times we would have incisions starting to form through these alluvial fans, which were cutting off the water supply. And so what we'd come up with is actually putting in what we call a flow splitter. And we would try to put these all over the alluvial fans to try to even out the water and push the water every direction and keep the whole thing wet. But in this particular instance, we had a little incision here, so you can see we put this V structure. And now, hopefully, with the water coming from this direction, it'll hit the V and we'll have water, going off both ways and staying out of the incision. All right, perennial stream restoration. The most appropriate treatment within a perennial are largely dependent on whether the channel is incised or whether the channel has access to its floodplain. That's kind of typically, at least when we're working in Santa Clara Creek, one of the first things we look at. If we have access to a floodplain, then we'll try to induce more meandering. If it's incised, we'll try to agrade it by using rock dams and trying to agrade that channel back to where it was historically. And a really good indication that we've been using, especially when we're working on a perennial stream, we also do this in the tributaries and the ephemeral channels as well, is we measure sinuosity, which is extremely important. Sinuosity kind of measures how much a stream will bend or wiggle, or how much meandering power it has. And it's basically the ratio between the stream length and the valley length. And so we can calculate that. We can, before we go in and do treatments, we can see what the sinuosity is. We can measure that out. A lot of times in Santa Clara Creek, we'll find that we have a sinuosity of maybe 105%, which historically before the fire was as high as 120%. And so we know we want to increase that sinuosity a great deal to kind of restore it back to where it was. And the great thing about increasing sinuosity, if you add maybe even just 20% of sinuosity onto a creek, you would think that by adding 20% sinuosity that, hey, yeah, I'm going to slow the water down by 20%. But it's actually astronomically more than that. By putting in like 20% of sinuosity, you're almost slowing the water down by 200%. So important point here is a little wiggle goes a long way. Very important to put some wiggle back into those creeks. And a lot of times, if you're working in a burned area and you don't have pre-treatment or pre-fire sinuosity information, you can get a hold of old aerial photos and, kind of calculate that yourself. Pull them into Google Earth or whatever and measure the valley length and then measure the stream length, and then you can kind of get that sinuosity factor and kind of give you a reference of where you can try to bring that creek back to where it was. So basically within Santa Clara Creek with hand crews, everything that I've done in Santa Clara Creek has always been with hand crews. We don't use heavy equipment or anything like that. We just source local rocks and local logs basically. But one of the tremendous structures that we've had a lot of luck with in Santa Clara Creek is called a rock baffle, which is basically just kind of a large triangle of packed rocks at a 30, 60, 90 degree triangle. And we'll usually build these about 2/3 of the way across the creek. And it doesn't really look like much, but you know, you're causing the creek to meander now. And every time you put in one of these, you're actually lengthening the creek as well. This one structure is probably going to add maybe 4 or 5 feet onto the entire length of the creek. The longer the creek is, the more the water is going to slow down. The more the creek meanders, the more natural deposition you're going to get. And with building these baffles, what we find a lot of times, if you come back a year or two later, this will actually create a mirror image of itself, and this whole back part will actually be a triangle as well of sediment deposited from the creek. Because the water's hitting here, it's going this way, but all the sediment is back spinning and depositing at the back of that baffle. So very effective structures. I love building baffles. Another very effective structure in the creek, of course, is the rock dam. And here we have, you know, a slightly incised channel. We didn't quite have access to the floodplain, so the best course of action for us was to actually try to grade the creek to get it close to that historic floodplain so we could actually, you know, get some overbanking, and maybe in the future, if that works and we actually grade this section of the creek, we can actually install baffles and, you know, begin this more intensive meandering process. And something else that's extremely important for us is actually all the monitoring we do. I've mentioned sinuosity and rock dams, but we do a fair amount of, we go out and actually set up a base station and figure out the cross-sectional and the longitudinal profiles of the creek. You know, before we do treatment, then we can come back a year later, measure that stuff again. We can actually, you know, quantify how much sinuosity our structures have had, how much aggregation that we've gotten from our rock dams. So incredibly important to actually go back and monitor this stuff. And we're pretty thorough when we do reporting for our 404 permits and stuff working in the creek. We give the Corps a lot of information, you know, on how our projects are going, and actually give them all these profiles. And this slide's really cool. So this is a section, this is maybe about a 1/4 mile or so, or 1,500 feet of creek. But this is a section that I worked with Bill Zedike up in the headwaters. And you know, here's the creek basically, is this line, but all these indicate all the different structures that we put in this 1/4 mile stretch. And you can tell we put in quite a bit of baffles and rock dams. But what's really exciting is at Santa Clara, we had a creek assessment done before the Los Conchas fire hit. So we knew exactly what the sinuosity was for this reach before we started. And you can tell that here on this blue line. That's the historic level of the creek before the fire hit. Now you can tell it's, you know, it's not as incised as these other lines, which I'll get to in a minute, but you also notice that it's a lot longer. The creek, you know, had a much more length before we got hit with these flash floods and the incisions hit. And so before we started doing this project, we wanted to measure that again and see where it was at, you know, before we started treating it. And that's this red line here. You can tell it's, you know, degraded quite a bit. The channel itself has dropped, it's incised, and it's a lot shorter in length. You know, it's not nearly as long as it used to be because of all the effects from the flash flooding and stuff that have incised this channel and have reduced its meandering capabilities. But however, after we did this project, we came back a couple years later and monitored exactly, you know, where we had brought the sinuosity to, which is this green line. As you can see, it's not where it was, but it's, you know, we're over halfway back to where it was when we started. We've also increased the length of the creek quite a bit from where it was before we started. And, you know, anytime we install baffles, we're increasing the length of the creek by about 5 feet with each baffle. So 20 baffles, that could be 100 feet of extra creek. And that's huge, that's 100 extra feet that can absorb floods, that can deposit sediment naturally. But this is pretty exciting to me because we were able to graph this out, and we can see that we've really increased the sinuosity, we're increasing the length of the creek, and we're slowing down the sediment. So a very effective way, I think, to monitor restoration projects is to really get into this sinuosity concept. And that's pretty much all I had. But if there's any questions or anything, let me